For 22 years, nobody questioned why the bridge security guard knew every structural weakness by heart, why he checked for explosive devices during routine patrols, why he always kept bomb disposal equipment nearby. The terrorists were about to find out why. Welcome to Faces Behind Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden expertise and explosive courage, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the silent guardians who protect our critical infrastructure. The Golden Gate Bridge's smaller cousin stretched across the Columbia River like a steel lifeline connecting two states. The Morrison Memorial Bridge carried 50,000 vehicles daily between Portland, Oregon, and the Washington shore, serving as a vital artery for commerce, commuters, and emergency services. At 2,100 feet long and 185 feet above the water, it was both an engineering marvel and a potential target for anyone wanting to cripple the region's transportation network. Built in 1958 and named after a local war hero, the bridge had become more than infrastructure. It was a symbol of connection, of communities linked across the rushing waters below. For 22 years, Carl Brennan had been the bridge's primary security guard. Working the day shift from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., 6 days a week, he maintained security protocols, conducted routine inspections, and served as the first line of defense for one of the Pacific Northwest's most important pieces of infrastructure. At 59, he was the kind of employee transportation departments valued, experienced, reliable, and completely familiar with every inch of the structure he protected. Most of the bridge personnel knew Carl as a quiet professional who took his job seriously. He walked the same patrol routes with methodical precision, maintained detailed logs of every vehicle and pedestrian crossing, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the bridge's structural systems, maintenance schedules, and emergency protocols. The morning commuters had grown accustomed to seeing him at his post, always alert, always watching. "Carl knows this bridge better than the engineers who built it," joked Lisa Park, the bridge operations supervisor who'd worked with Carl for 12 years. "I swear he can hear when something's wrong, just by the way the steel sounds in the wind." "More than that," added Tom Rodriguez, a maintenance worker who'd been on the bridge crew for 8 years. "Guy treats this place like it's Fort Knox, does security sweeps that aren't even in his job description. My kids ask about him every time we drive across. They call him the bridge protector. Sometimes I think he cares more about this bridge than his own house. But there were things about Carl Brennan that didn't quite add up if you knew what to look for. His security rounds weren't just visual inspections. They followed patterns designed to detect potential explosive devices and security vulnerabilities. He carried equipment that seemed excessive for routine bridge security, including detection devices and communication gear that appeared to be military grade. His personal vehicle always parked in a position that allowed quick access to emergency routes. Most telling of all, Carl had an unusual knowledge of structural engineering and demolition techniques that went far beyond what civilian security training would provide. The local FBI field office had noticed Carl's competence during the post-9/11 security upgrades. When federal agents had conducted vulnerability assessments of critical infrastructure, Carl had identified potential attack vectors and defensive measures that impressed counterterrorism specialists. His suggestions for enhanced security protocols had been adopted as standard recommendations for similar structures throughout the region. One agent had quietly noted in his report that Carl's tactical thinking resembled that of someone with extensive military training, though no official records supported that assessment. During the 2 bomb threats the bridge had received over the years, Carl had responded with a calm professionalism that seemed unusual for a civilian security guard. He'd coordinated with bomb disposal units using technical language that suggested extensive training and had provided tactical assessments that helped law enforcement clear the structure efficiently. The FBI agents had been quietly impressed by his knowledge of blast patterns and structural vulnerabilities. "Guy thinks like a bomb tech," muttered Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, who'd worked with Carl during a credible threat assessment 3 years earlier. "Sometimes I think he knows more about explosives than half my team." What Agent Chen didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Carl Brennan had spent 20 years in the Navy, including 12 years as an explosive ordnance disposal technician and 6 years as a Navy SEAL, specializing in underwater demolition and structural assault operations. He'd been part of teams that conducted bridge assessments, facility protection, and counter-demolition missions in some of the world's most dangerous environments. Carl's specialty had been infrastructure protection and explosive threat assessment. He'd spent years learning to identify structural vulnerabilities, understand how demolition charges worked, and develop countermeasures against enemies who used civilian infrastructure as weapons. The knowledge had been burned into his memory through countless training exercises and real-world missions where failure meant catastrophic civilian casualties. His final deployment had been to Iraq, where he'd spent 18 months protecting critical bridges and transportation networks from insurgents who specialized in turning everyday structures into strategic targets. That deployment had ended with a mission that still haunted Carl's dreams. Insurgents had attempted to destroy a bridge that served as the only evacuation route for a civilian population trapped by sectarian violence. Carl's team had discovered the plot hours before detonation, but the sophisticated nature of the explosive devices had required techniques that pushed the limits of even Navy SEAL training. 3 of his teammates hadn't made it home from that operation. Carl had left the Navy in 2001 with an honorable discharge, a chest full of medals he'd never displayed, and skills that translated perfectly to civilian infrastructure protection. The bridge security job had been ideal. It allowed him to use his structural and demolition knowledge in a peaceful environment while protecting the kind of critical infrastructure he'd spent his military career defending. For 22 years, he'd found peace in the rhythm of security patrols, treating each shift like a mission that required constant vigilance and professional preparation. His bridge was his area of responsibility, and he protected it with the same dedication he'd once brought to military operations overseas. The commuters who crossed daily had no idea they were under the protection of someone who'd once defended bridges in war zones. But on a Tuesday morning in November, Carl's 2 worlds collided in the most explosive way possible. It was 8:47 a.m. when he noticed them. Carl was conducting his routine structural inspection when his trained eye caught something that made his blood run cold: fresh tool marks on one of the bridge's support cable housings and traces of what looked like clay-based material near a critical structural joint. Someone had been placing explosive devices on his bridge, professional work, not the crude attempts of amateurs. Carl's mind shifted into a mode he thought he'd left behind 22 years ago: threat assessment, explosive identification, structural analysis. The quiet bridge security guard was disappearing, replaced by the Navy EOD technician who'd once defused bombs in environments where a single mistake could kill hundreds of people. He activated the tactical radio he'd carried for years, an unofficial upgrade that connected directly to FBI and Homeland Security frequencies, and began transmitting coded position reports while he conducted a more detailed assessment of the situation. What Carl discovered made him realize that this wasn't just a terrorist attack. It was a precisely planned demolition designed to bring down the entire bridge during peak traffic hours. 5 explosive devices had been placed at critical structural points, each one sophisticated enough to require professional demolition expertise. The charges were timed to detonate in sequence, creating a cascade failure that would drop the bridge into the Columbia River, along with everyone on it. Carl counted at least 40 vehicles currently crossing the span, including a school bus full of children on a field trip. But Carl also noticed something that the bombers hadn't counted on. Their placement patterns followed textbook demolition techniques, which meant he could predict where the remaining devices would be located and how they'd been wired. He'd seen this exact configuration before in Iraq, and he knew exactly how to counter it. Carl reached for his emergency phone to call the bomb squad, then stopped. The nearest EOD team was 30 minutes away, and the timer mechanisms he'd identified showed less than 15 minutes until detonation. By the time help arrived, the Morrison Memorial Bridge and everyone on it would be at the bottom of the river. Time to act. Carl opened the secure equipment locker he'd maintained in the bridge's operations center, disguised as standard maintenance supplies, but containing tools he'd hoped never to need again. military-grade detection equipment, bomb disposal tools, and a collection of specialized devices that had been selected for their dual-purpose potential in protecting critical infrastructure. The equipment had been carefully acquired over the years through legitimate channels, each piece justified as enhanced security measures that no one questioned from such a dedicated employee. But as Carl began his approach to the first device, he heard footsteps on the metal grating above him. The bombers hadn't just planted their explosives and left. They were still on the bridge, probably to ensure their plan succeeded and to prevent exactly the kind of intervention Carl was attempting. 5 terrorists, unknown additional weapons, thousands of civilians on the bridge, multiple explosive devices with active timers. It was exactly the kind of infrastructure defense scenario he'd trained for his entire military career. Carl slipped into the network of maintenance passages that honeycombed the bridge's superstructure, moving through areas that were invisible to casual observers, but as familiar to him as his own apartment. 22 years of security patrols had taught him every access point, every hiding spot, every tactical advantage that could be exploited in defending his bridge. The first terrorist never saw him coming. The man was positioned near the bridge's main span, using his rifle to prevent anyone from approaching the explosive devices, while his partners maintained overwatch positions. Carl emerged from a maintenance hatch directly behind him, moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him an effective SEAL. A security baton became a weapon, and the terrorist was unconscious and zip-tied before he could raise an alarm. 1 down, 4 to go. But Carl's real advantage wasn't superior training. It was superior knowledge. He knew every cable, every joint, every structural element that these terrorists were trying to destroy. He understood how their explosives worked, where they'd be most vulnerable, and how to approach them without triggering the secondary devices designed to kill bomb disposal technicians. The second terrorist was neutralized when Carl used the bridge's own movement in the wind to mask his approach, closing the distance during a period of structural vibration that concealed the sound of his footsteps on the metal decking. The third and fourth went down when Carl activated the bridge's emergency lighting system, creating enough confusion and disorientation to allow for rapid, silent takedowns. That left 1 terrorist and 5 active explosive devices with less than 8 minutes until detonation. Carl found the final bomber standing guard over the primary demolition charge, a sophisticated device placed at the bridge's main support cable that would trigger the cascade failure even if the other bombs were neutralized. The man was young, maybe 25, with the focused intensity of someone who believed he was about to change history. "Step away from the device," Carl said quietly, emerging from behind a support beam with his hands visible but ready. "You don't want to do this." The terrorist spun toward him, automatic weapon rising, but Carl was already moving. 22 years of civilian life hadn't dulled reflexes honed in the world's most dangerous places. The bomber found himself disarmed and restrained before he fully understood what had happened. But neutralizing the terrorists was only half the mission. Carl still had 5 sophisticated explosive devices to disarm in less than 6 minutes, and each one required the kind of precise work that couldn't be rushed without triggering a catastrophic explosion. Carl approached the first device with the calm focus that had kept him alive during dozens of similar situations in Iraq. The bomb was sophisticated, multiple redundancies, anti-tamper mechanisms, and a timer that showed 5 minutes and 38 seconds until detonation. But Carl recognized the design. He'd seen similar devices overseas, and more importantly, he understood the mindset of the people who built them. The wire configuration, the trigger mechanism, even the type of explosive used, it all pointed to training he'd encountered before in the deserts of Iraq. Device by device, Carl worked his way through the explosive network. His hands moved with the steady precision of someone who'd performed these procedures under combat conditions, while his mind calculated blast radii, structural vulnerabilities, and the sequence in which the charges would need to be disarmed to prevent sympathetic detonation. Each wire cut brought back memories of Iraq, of teammates who hadn't been fast enough, of bridges that had fallen despite their best efforts. With 47 seconds remaining on the final timer, Carl cut the last wire and watched the digital display go dark. The Morrison Memorial Bridge was safe. When FBI agents and bomb disposal teams arrived 20 minutes later, they found 5 sophisticated explosive devices safely disarmed, 5 unconscious terrorists zip-tied and ready for transport, and a bridge security guard calmly filling out his incident report as if nothing unusual had happened. The questions came immediately and intensively. Who was he? How had he known what to do? Where had he learned to disarm military-grade explosives? Carl answered them with the same quiet professionalism he'd brought to 22 years of bridge security. Yes, he'd served in the Navy. Yes, he'd been trained for situations involving explosive devices. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done to protect the infrastructure and people who couldn't protect themselves. But the investigation revealed more than Carl had wanted known. Military records that had been classified for years suddenly became relevant to a federal terrorism case. His service as a Navy EOD technician and SEAL, his deployments to combat zones, his specialized training in infrastructure protection and counter-demolition operations. It all came out in the reports and witness statements. The photo in the bridge operations office, the one showing 22 years of perfect attendance and safety awards, suddenly took on new meaning. That quiet security guard in the background of every department photo wasn't just Carl the bridge guard. He was Senior Chief Petty Officer Brennan, decorated combat veteran, a warrior who'd spent 22 years quietly protecting one of the region's most vital pieces of infrastructure. When Carl returned to work a week later, everything had changed. Bridge personnel who'd barely spoken to him for years now stopped to shake his hand and thank him. Transportation officials who'd worked alongside him for over 2 decades looked at him with new respect and understanding. The Department of Homeland Security sent a delegation to meet the man who'd single-handedly prevented what could have been the worst infrastructure attack in American history. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" asked Lisa Park as they stood on the bridge's main span, looking out at the thousands of vehicles that crossed safely every day because of Carl's actions. Carl was quiet for a moment, watching the Columbia River flow beneath the bridge he'd protected for over 2 decades. "Some things are better left in the past," he said finally. "I came here to guard a bridge, not to fight wars. But you saved thousands of lives." "I protected my bridge," Carl replied simply. "Same thing I've been doing for 22 years, just more obvious this time." The Morrison Memorial Bridge reopened for normal traffic the next day with enhanced security measures and a small memorial plaque near the operations center where the incident had taken place. It didn't mention Carl by name. He'd specifically requested that it not, but simply read, "In honor of those who stand watch over the pathways that connect our communities." Carl Brennan continued his security patrols, walking the same routes and maintaining the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. But now people knew who he really was and what he'd been willing to do to keep them safe. The American flag that flew from the bridge's highest point didn't carry his name either. But everyone who saw it knew exactly who it honored and why a simple bridge had become a symbol of the hidden heroes who protect our most vital infrastructure. Sometimes guardians wear uniforms and carry weapons. Sometimes they wear security badges and patrol bridges, watching over the connections that keep our society functioning. Carl Brennan had been both kinds of guardian, and in the end, that's all he'd ever wanted to be, someone who stood watch over the pathways that brought people safely home. The bridge was his responsibility, the travelers were his mission, and for 22 years, he'd never let them down. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet vigilance protected the infrastructure you depend on without you knowing the threats they were watching for? Someone who stood guard over the bridges, roads, and connections that keep our world functioning. Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching Faces Behind Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe to support the channel. We publish stories that matter, stories that remind us that heroes don't always announce themselves, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones quietly protecting the structures we take for granted. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, you never know who's standing guard over the pathways you travel every day.